My daughter-in-law smiled when I signed the waiver that said I'd never ask them for care or support. My son stood by the window, pretending not to hear. I felt something collapse inside me that day. But a week later, when my lawyer read out the truth about my net worth, their smiles didn't last. What they thought was the end of me was only the beginning. It was Thanksgiving, the kind where the air smells like cinnamon and turkey, and you tell yourself to be grateful, even if something inside you feels off. I had only been living with Victor and Kristen for a few weeks, still healing from the hip fracture. They had insisted I come stay while I recovered, said it would be easier on everyone. Kristen set the table like a magazine spread. Everything perfect. Pumpkin candles, cloth napkins folded into tiny birds. She smiled, like always, tight-lipped and glossy-eyed. Victor barely spoke. He kept scrolling through his phone between bites of cranberry sauce. When the plates were cleared and the pie was still untouched, Kristen brought out a folder. Beige. Plain. No label. She set it next to my plate and said, still smiling, "This is just a formality. Something our family attorney recommended. It's called a voluntary waiver of support. Just means you're independent. It's symbolic." I looked at Victor. He didn't meet my eyes. Inside the paper said things like, "I waive all claims to financial assistance from my children. I relinquish expectations of care. I understand I am not legally owed emotional, physical, or financial support from Victor Ellsworth and Kristen Ellsworth now or in the future." I signed it. My hands didn't shake. I didn't make a fuss. I picked up the pen, wrote my name, and handed it back. Kristen folded it gently as if it were a thank you card. Then she passed me the sweet potato pie with marshmallows on top. Nobody spoke about it again. That night I went back up to the attic. My room. Not the guest room, not the mother-in-law suite. Just the attic. The heat barely reached there. I had a space heater and a fleece blanket with snowmen on it. The next morning, the bookshelf Joseph had built me was gone. It used to sit in the corner of the hallway, filled with his aviation books and my recipe cards. Kristen said it made the place feel cluttered. She replaced it with a vertical mirror and a basket of rolled yoga mats. They turned the study into Kristen's filming room. Ring lights, mats, dumbbells, posters that said things like "choose joy" and "mind over matter." My cast was itchy. The stairs were hard, and no one ever offered me coffee in the morning. I don't think they hated me. That's not what this is about. It was more like I didn't fit the design. I didn't match the new aesthetic. I told myself it was temporary. But then they moved Joseph's chair to the garage, said it looked too old, said they wanted to freshen things up. Maybe that's when I knew something was being rewritten. Quietly, without yelling, without blame. Just the quiet removal of things that reminded them I existed. I don't know if you've ever felt that. Being erased softly, not out of anger but convenience. And I wonder sometimes, for those of you listening, when did you first notice someone trying to erase you? Was it a chair? A drawer? A photo frame quietly replaced? I didn't say anything. Not yet. Because I still believed silence was safer. But silence, as I would learn, has its own sharp edges, and they cut deeper when you're the only one bleeding. It was the second Tuesday after Thanksgiving when I finally opened the blue tin box. It had sat untouched at the back of the closet for over a decade, buried under old flannel sheets and holiday decorations. Joseph gave it to me the year before he passed. Said it was just some paperwork he didn't want in the safe. Back then, I didn't question anything he did. He had always been precise, a man who believed in backups for backups. I pulled it out that morning while Victor and Kristen were gone. The house was quiet, except for the faint hum of the washing machine downstairs. My hip still ached, but I moved slower now anyway, not from pain, but from caution. Inside the tin was a stack of manila folders, all labelled, all typed. Joseph's neat handwriting marked a few pages, the kind of notes an engineer would leave for a fellow engineer. Logical, sparse, efficient. I expected bank statements, maybe a few insurance policies. What I didn't expect were 20 years' worth of investment summaries. I recognized our old brokerage accounts, but the balances made me pause. Then I found it. A full spreadsheet printout from 3 years before he died with my name at the top. Not his. Mine. IRA accounts, trust funds, municipal bonds, all diversified, all in my name. There were also quarterly reports from a financial firm in Connecticut. I didn't even remember opening an account there. But it was real. The numbers were there. Every asset, every holding meticulously logged and updated. I counted the total 3 times before it sank in. $77 million. Joseph had moved everything under my name, gradually starting in the late 90s. He had taken care of the legal transfers quietly. I saw notarized documents with dates I vaguely remembered back when I was busy volunteering at the library and baking for church events. I never thought to ask what he was doing in his home office every evening. And now it made sense why he never seemed concerned about retirement, why he never pushed me to go back to work after I left the accounting firm. He knew. He had planned for it. For me. There was a letter too, folded neatly behind a divider marked Marjorie, personal. It wasn't long, just a few lines. He wrote that life had taught him to prepare for the moments we don't see coming, that if I ever found myself alone, I should know he'd made sure I was never truly alone, and that this wealth was not a gift, but recognition of what we'd built together. I sat on the floor for a long time, the papers spread out like wings around me. It didn't feel like power. Not then. It felt like Joseph still trying to protect me from the shadows of what might come. I gathered everything and returned it to the tin. Then I placed the tin in a new spot, one Kristen wouldn't think to touch, behind a row of dusty cookbooks in the attic's far cabinet. That night over dinner, Kristen talked about a new course she was launching online. She wanted to invest in rebranding. She said we might need to consider a home equity loan. Victor nodded. I just listened. I had always believed that silence was something soft, something gentle. But that evening my silence felt different. Not fear, not surrender. It felt like a pause, a steadying breath before something begins. ChatGPT, Danoi. Under the cold light of a January morning, I walked into the living room and felt it immediately. Something was missing. The oak bookshelf Joseph and I bought in 1983, the one that held every tax manual gardening book and our wedding album, was gone. In its place stood a sleek white bench with 2 rolled yoga mats stacked neatly on top. I stood there for a while, hand pressed lightly to the wall as if the memories had left fingerprints I could still feel. Kristen passed by earbuds, in barely glancing at me as she headed to the kitchen. Her new ritual involved green juices and a blender that roared like a jet engine. I didn't say a word. I simply turned around and went upstairs. The hallway smelled of lavender spray. I opened the linen closet. My blankets were gone, replaced with rolled white towels and labelled baskets. When I reached my attic room, the temperature was low again. Kristen insisted it was just bad insulation, but the truth was, she had turned off the vent. Said it helped save on energy bills. I pulled the quilt tighter around my shoulders. Over the next few days, little things disappeared. A set of framed photos from my room. A clay dish Joseph gave me on our 10th anniversary. Even the old pillow with my initials stitched into the corner. Kristen never said anything. Neither did Victor. One morning I went into the kitchen and saw the refrigerator covered in Kristen's printed schedules. Fitness plans, smoothie prep calendars, and a printed quote that read, "Let go of what no longer serves you." I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the end of the counter, scribbling into a small notebook I kept in my apron pocket. I started listing every object that vanished, every wall that had been repainted, every piece of my presence that slowly dissolved into the new order of the house. Monday bookshelf gone. Tuesday hallway rugs replaced with foam tiles. Wednesday coat hooks removed. Thursday, Joseph's photo from the mantel no longer there. There was no confrontation, no shouting, just a steady, calculated erasure. The tipping point came when I reached for my recipe box one evening. It had always sat on the far shelf near the microwave. I had my mother's pecan pie recipe in there, and the cornbread I made every Christmas. But now that shelf held a ceramic Buddha and a flickering LED candle. Kristen walked in as I was opening cabinets, looking for something she said not unkindly, but with a tone I'd come to recognize. Firm. Final. I said nothing, just nodded and returned to my room. That night I took out my notebook and renamed it. On the front cover I wrote Erasure Log. Every detail I could recall I wrote down, from the change in air fresheners to the way Kristen began referring to me as her husband's mother instead of by name, from Victor's sidelong glances when I entered a room to the passive silence that seemed to grow louder each day. I realized what was happening wasn't accidental. It wasn't a spring cleaning or a shift in home decor. It was something far more deliberate. An unspoken campaign to remove not just my belongings, but my memory, my imprint from this house. Late one night, I stood by the front window. The lights from the street softened the edges of the living room below. I could see Kristen's new meditation corner complete with bamboo plants and a salt lamp. I imagined the space how it used to be: Joseph in his recliner, the dog asleep at his feet, Victor on the floor playing with building blocks. None of that remained. In the stillness, I felt something move inside me. Not anger, not grief, but a clear, sharp awareness. They didn't want a house with me in it. They wanted a house where I had never existed. I returned to my attic room and opened the tin box again, not to recount the money, but to confirm what I already knew, that even if my name faded from their hallway walls and family photos, it would not be erased from the things that mattered most. The ownership papers, the trusts, the investments Joseph built in my name. That truth sat there unshaken. I added one final note in my log that night. They are not aware I am the storm they are quietly sweeping out. The morning after the first snow of December, I stood in the hallway, one hand resting on the wooden railing, the other gripping the edge of my sweater. The silence in the house felt sharper than usual. Kristen's laughter had stopped, and Victor's footsteps echoed faintly as he made his way downstairs. I caught his reflection through the crack of the guest room door. He stood there for a moment, eyes on me, mouth parted slightly like he had something to say, but nothing came out, just a nod. Then he walked away. It was the first time I saw it so clearly. The betrayal didn't come with shouting or slamming doors. It came wrapped in quietness, like someone leaving the window open in winter and never bothering to close it. Cold, creeping in slowly. That morning, Kristen brought out a new set of house plans and spread them across the dining table. Her voice was syrupy as she spoke to Victor, pointing at areas she wanted to modernize. She circled my bedroom in red marker, saying it would make a great meditation room. I wasn't asked. My name wasn't mentioned. I had become furniture, something to be rearranged. I walked past them, pretending not to hear, but my mind had already begun documenting everything. I pulled out the small leather notebook Joseph once gave me and began writing again. I titled that page Erasure Log, Day 47. That night I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, rehearsing the details of the afternoon. Kristen had said the word permanent while gesturing to the garage. Victor had hesitated, his hand hovering over the corner of the blueprint. That tiny pause, that flicker of discomfort, it gave me enough reason to know he wasn't entirely blind, just weak. I got out of bed, padded downstairs, and stood in front of the bathroom mirror. My reflection stared back, tired eyes, silver hair tied back neatly, a face both too quiet and too knowing. I hadn't cried, not since Joseph passed. But that night, my throat ached in the same way it did the day I buried him, the ache of knowing I had to carry something alone. Again. The next morning I tried something different. I made tea and placed it on the kitchen counter before Kristen walked in from her early run. I said, "You know Joseph always dreamed of putting in a greenhouse in the backyard. That patch behind the fence, it gets the best light." Kristen didn't look up from her protein shake. She mumbled, and wiped down the counter where I had placed the cup. She moved the mug aside as if it were in the way. That was the moment I realized the war wasn't over space or money. It was over memory, over meaning. She was trying to delete Joseph from the house, one suggestion at a time. One repaint, one rearrangement, one silenced conversation. I returned to my notebook. Erasure log, day 48. Photo albums moved. Greenhouse idea ignored. Joseph's chair disappeared. By the end of that week, they had started packing up the garage. Boxes labeled old keepsakes were stacked neatly in the back. Kristen had hired a staging consultant to help declutter. It wasn't just the objects she was erasing. It was Joseph's handwriting on old receipts, the smell of his pipe that still lingered on the wool coat in the closet, the sound of the floor creaking where he always paused before reaching the door. And I knew if I didn't act, the last traces of my husband's existence in this house would vanish. So I made a quiet plan. I started scanning old letters and saving them to a flash drive I kept hidden inside a hollowed-out book. I labeled each file by date, by handwriting, by smell. Joseph's letter, March 1984, smells of cedar and ink. That night I opened one of the scanned letters and read a line that stopped my breath. "If they forget our love, let it be because we kept it too sacred to be paraded, not because we let it fade." I closed the file and sat in the dark, the soft hum of the space heater, the only sound in the room. I was no longer just a mother-in-law in someone else's house. I was now the sole keeper of our shared history, the only witness, the only archive, and I wasn't going to let it be erased. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of grey winter day where the sun barely pushed through the clouds. I had just come down from the attic to warm a bowl of soup when I heard Kristen on the phone. Her voice echoed from the bottom of the stairs, clear and unfiltered, louder than usual. She was laughing. Not the pleasant kind that fills a room with warmth. No, this was sharp and triumphant. I paused halfway down the steps, just out of sight, the wooden railing pressing into my palm. She said, "Oh, trust me, by spring it'll all be in our names. She won't even see it coming. Victor's finally on board." Another laugh followed, high and cutting. Then something about transferring full ownership. Something about letting go of dead weight. I didn't move. I didn't blink. The words hung in the air like smoke after a house fire. And right then I knew. Whatever illusion I had left that this was just poor communication or simple distance between generations, it was gone. This was calculated. I slipped back up the stairs without a sound heart thudding against my ribs. In the attic, I opened the drawer beneath my sewing kit and retrieved the old voice recorder Joseph and I once used during tax season. I clicked the button. A red light blinked. For the first time since Joseph's passing, I wasn't grieving. I was watching, listening. preparing. That night, I wrote a new entry in my notebook. Erasure log, day 51. Audio recording captured. Kristen speaking of full transfer. Victor in agreement, likely manipulated but no longer innocent. At dinner, I looked across the table at my son. He was slicing into his chicken, nodding absently at Kristen's retelling of a new online client success. I stared at the face I once wiped applesauce off of, the boy who used to run crying to me after a bad dream. And I couldn't see that boy anymore, just a man with a lowered gaze. Victor hadn't asked me a personal question in weeks. He hadn't once mentioned the cold draft in my attic room, or the fact that I no longer used the shared laundry. When I did speak, his replies were short, automatic, as though any longer might invite guilt. And guilt, I realized, was something he could not afford to feel if he wanted to keep Kristen's approval. That night, I called Gary. It had been years since we last spoke. He had been Joseph's closest friend, his fishing buddy and confidant. After Joseph died, Gary sent a card and offered legal help if I ever needed it. I had tucked it away, thinking I would never need a lawyer again. But I needed him now. We spoke in low tones, and I told him everything. About the forms Kristen had me sign. The documents, I suspected, were altered. The renovations, the missing photographs, and now this recorded conversation. Gary was quiet for a long moment before saying, "You're not paranoid, Marjorie. You're being erased with intention. But it's not too late. Joseph made sure of that." His words settled into my spine like a steel rod. There was still a way to stop this, not through shouting, not through begging, through precision. The next morning, I met Gary at a small coffee shop downtown. We sat in a booth near the back, surrounded by the hum of espresso machines and quiet jazz. I slid the recorder across the table. He listened. His face didn't flinch. When it clicked off, he nodded slowly. "She's laying groundwork for a transfer under marital property," he said. "But if we move quickly, we can shift your holdings into a private trust. We'll name it after Joseph, and she'll never touch it." I swallowed. "What about Victor?" "He's legally uninvolved for now," Gary said. "But if we push too hard too fast, he might get pulled in deeper. Let's use their confidence against them." For the first time in weeks, my shoulders loosened. There was a path forward, and I had a guide. Back at the house, I returned to the attic, clutching the folder Gary had handed me. Inside were documents, templates, instructions. He would handle the filings. I just had to gather the necessary proofs. Kristen was in the kitchen when I came down. She smiled and asked if I wanted a protein shake. I said I'd pass. She didn't press. Her confidence was her weakness. That night, I moved the box of Joseph's letters and the ledger into a suitcase under my bed. I labeled it ski gear in bold marker. Nobody would check. I wasn't afraid anymore. Not of being pushed out, not of being forgotten, because now I had names, paper, audio, and soon power. It was raining that morning when I met Gary at Dottie's Diner, the kind of place that hadn't changed since the 1970s. Vinyl booths, checkered tile floors, the same waitress with cherry earrings who remembered everyone's name. We didn't say much at first. Gary ordered black coffee. I asked for tea with lemon. We sat in the booth near the back, the one under the framed newspaper from the year Elvis died. Rain tapped steadily on the window beside us. I slid the envelope across the table. Inside were the copies of Kristen's forged documents, the audio from the stairway, and 2 pages from Joseph's old ledger, with his handwriting showing the separation of assets. Gary opened it carefully, nodding his brows, furrowing with each line he read. "She's not just overstepping," he said finally. "She's laying down a legal trail. These are attempts to establish de facto control. But if we shift your holdings now, we can box her out before she gets bold enough to bring a lawyer." His voice was low, matter-of-fact, reassuring in a way I didn't realize I needed. I looked around the diner. No one paid us any attention. It felt safe there, like nothing could reach me inside that little cocoon of formica and coffee steam. He reached under the table and gently patted my hand. "You're not overreacting. This is the moment to move." I nodded. We spent the next hour going over details. He explained the foundation we'd create named in honor of Joseph. Not just as a shield, but as a legacy. The Joseph M. Ellsworth Foundation. It would be a private non-profit with funds directed toward local scholarships, elder care grants, and literacy initiatives. All things Joseph had quietly supported for decades. It wasn't just about protecting money. It was about defining where it went and who it served. And it would remove any access Kristen thought she was entitled to. I signed the initial paperwork with a pen I brought from home, one of Joseph's old pens. I remember the way it scratched against the legal pad. Final. Clean. Gary leaned in. "We'll file this quietly over the next 3 weeks. I'll create a shell trust to start, so it looks like minor portfolio adjustments. Once the transfer is complete, Kristen and Victor won't know until it's irreversible." I exhaled. It felt like releasing a breath I'd been holding since Thanksgiving. Back at home, the air in the house felt thinner. Kristen was in her studio upstairs, shouting cues into her headset for some online yoga class. Victor wasn't home yet. I slipped into the kitchen, boiled water for tea, and pulled out my small notebook. I began making lists, not just legal documents or assets, but memories, names, places, people who had stood by me, people who could be allies. Not many, but enough. A few women from the church who had seen me struggle with my cane last month and offered rides. A neighbor who used to work in local government. My old colleague May from the town accounting office. I made a separate list of what had disappeared from the house since I moved in. Photo albums, books, the sewing machine, the quilt Joseph's mother made, the spice rack with handwritten labels. It wasn't about material things, it was about erosion. Kristen was sanding away the texture of my life. That night I cooked dinner before anyone came home. Roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, fresh green beans with lemon. Something simple. Familiar. I set the table with the good dishes. Kristen walked in first. She raised an eyebrow, then quickly smoothed it out. "Smells nice," she said, hanging her gym bag by the door. Victor came in 5 minutes later, gave me a tired half smile. I could tell he smelled the food but didn't know what to say. We sat, ate, talked about weather, nothing real. Under the table, I slid a folded paper toward Victor. He didn't look down right away. But when he did, his eyes flicked to mine for just a second. It was the first full look I'd gotten from him in weeks. He tucked the paper into his shirt pocket and went back to chewing. It was a copy of my new mailing address for the Joseph M. Ellsworth Foundation. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. Later that night, I stood in the hallway, listening to the faint hum of Kristen's treadmill from behind her closed door, then the quiet tick of Victor brushing his teeth. The house creaked like it always did at night. But something had shifted. I wasn't invisible anymore. I had a name, a signature, a plan, and now a foundation that bore my husband's name, one no one could erase. I was making tea when Kristen came into the kitchen with a stack of freshly printed papers in her hand. She placed them on the table with the kind of softness you'd expect from someone setting down a birthday card. But I knew better. That paper wasn't kind. Her voice was gentler than usual, almost hesitant. She said these were just a few small updates, something to tidy up the household responsibilities and medical decisions. I didn't say anything. I just stirred my tea like I hadn't heard a word. She pulled out a chair and sat down across from me. That was new. Kristen rarely sat when she could stand above someone. But today she seemed careful, like a woman walking across ice that hadn't frozen solid. She slid the pages toward me, smiling in a way that didn't touch her eyes. I looked down at the document without moving my hands. I let the silence build. When I finally reached for a pen, I didn't sign the way she expected. I wrote my name in the margin. Tiny, crooked, barely legible. It was enough. Then I looked up and asked her for a copy of what I'd just signed. That caught her off guard. She blinked fast and said she needed to check with Victor first. I told her I'd wait. She stood, gathered the pages a little too quickly, and left the kitchen without another word. I listened to the sound of her steps fade into the hallway, the door to the study clicking shut. I finished my tea in silence, then walked upstairs to the little alcove off the attic, where they had tucked my boxes after the move. Among all the dust and forgotten linens, I found the accordion folder I had labelled in pencil, legal and quiet. It was where I had started keeping everything. Photos, receipts, notes, a copy of the first document Kristen had asked me to sign back in November. I placed the new paper inside it, along with a line in my notebook that read, Kristen, March 14th, pushed new forms, no details given, refused copy. That night I barely slept. Victor didn't say anything during dinner. Kristen was all smiles and energy, chatting about repainting the guest room and how she might turn the sunroom into her yoga recording space. I ate quietly, nodding when needed. I noticed the way Victor kept glancing down at his plate. He didn't look up at me once. After dinner, I returned to the kitchen and checked the trash. The top layer was full of shredded mail. Underneath, I found the printout of a design layout for the home titled Ellsworth Family Renovation Plan, Phase 2. My name wasn't mentioned anywhere. The next day, Kristen left for her gym shoot. Victor stayed home working from his office. I knocked on the door after lunch and asked him if he had the papers I'd signed. He froze. I watched the colour drain from his face. He said he wasn't sure what I meant. I nodded, then walked away. That afternoon, I went back to the attic and pulled out the small voice recorder I'd hidden inside my knitting basket. It was old, the kind Joseph used during his lectures. I changed the batteries, tested it, and slipped it into my robe pocket. That night, when Kristen came into my room with her overly sweet voice, asking if I needed help uploading my Medicare forms, I hit record. The conversation was dull technical, even until she slipped. She mentioned she had already filled in some of my preferences for the advanced directive. She said it with a laugh, like it wasn't a big deal. But I heard the pride in her voice, the control. I smiled and thanked her. After she left, I saved the file and wrote the date on a new index card, March 15th. Directive preferences discussed before permission granted. I knew what she was trying to do. She was closing the door from the inside, creating a space where my name could be erased slowly, one quiet form at a time. But I had started building something too. It didn't look like a fight. It looked like peace. Folders, notes, voice recordings, and above all, patience. I wasn't signing anything else. I wasn't asking for explanations. I was watching and waiting, because I had learned something vital. When someone tries to silence you with smiles and paper, the most powerful thing you can do is keep the record. Not for revenge, but for truth. And that truth was growing file by file right there in the attic, in the room they thought I'd forgotten. But I hadn't. Not even close. The morning sun crept in slow that day, spilling soft light across the wood floor like a memory trying to stay. I came down for coffee, moving carefully as always, hand on the rail steps even. What greeted me in the living room made my stomach drop. The mantel was bare. Where Joseph's photo once sat alongside the flag from his military service and the rosewood urn with his wedding ring. Inside a small glass case, there was now nothing but a framed motivational quote and a jade plant in a white ceramic pot. Kristen stood nearby, fluffing a pillow on the couch, humming to herself. I stared at the empty space above the fireplace. She caught my look and smiled without blinking. She said the house needed to breathe, that too much nostalgia held back new energy. She used words like realignment and renewal, as if the erasure of memory could be called healing. I didn't respond. I walked to the window and let my hands rest on the sill. The silence stretched until she filled it. She told me she had packed everything neatly into a storage bin, said it was labeled and safe. Then she turned and left, not waiting for my reaction, not needing it. I didn't go looking for the box. I didn't want to see how neatly my past had been folded into plastic. Later that afternoon, while she was out running errands and Victor was on a call, I went to my bedroom. It had changed too. The quilt I had brought from my old house was gone, replaced by a grey coverlet, clean and cold. The lace curtains had been swapped for blackout panels. The shelf where I kept the anniversary clock Joseph gave me had been cleared. In its place was a diffuser and a stack of self-help books I had never read. I opened my closet. My old scarves, the ones Joseph used to buy me from small shops in the towns we passed through during his work trips, were missing. I found them later in a donation bag tucked inside the garage. I took one back, a pale blue silk one with tiny yellow flowers. I folded it and slipped it into the pocket of my cardigan. It felt like reclaiming a breath. That night I sat at the foot of my bed and looked around the room. It didn't belong to me anymore. Not really. The shape of it, the scent of lavender replaced by peppermint, the angles of the furniture all felt like someone else's idea of comfort. So I made a small change. From the back of my dresser drawer, I pulled out the only photo I had managed to keep with me from the old house. It was taken the summer after Joseph retired. We were standing under a maple tree, his arm around my shoulder, both of us squinting into the light. He had just started helping me manage the small investments we had made over the years. That was when the seed of the foundation had started, though. Neither of us knew what it would become. I found a small wooden frame, one of the few things left untouched. I placed the photo inside and set it on the nightstand, angled just slightly toward my pillow. No one noticed. Not right away. The next morning, Kristen walked past my room with a laundry basket. She paused for a second at the doorway. I didn't look up from my book. She didn't say anything. But later, when I went downstairs, I saw her rearranging the living room shelves again. One of the church ladies had dropped off a bouquet of lilies for me. I placed them next to Joseph's photo on the nightstand. That night, I lit a small candle next to it. Nothing dramatic, just a flame of photo and a whisper of the life I had lived before they started painting over it. I wasn't just defending a memory anymore. I was creating a boundary, a quiet one. The scarf, the photo, the candle, symbols of a self that refused to disappear. I added a new entry in my notebook. March 23rd, home aesthetics altered, memorial items removed without discussion, reclaimed one scarf and restored one photograph. The list grew longer, but so did my resolve. They had removed the altar, but they hadn't removed my belief in Joseph, in what we built, in the quiet, deliberate act of remembering. I was no longer just preserving things. I was preparing for what came next. The morning unfolded like any other. Kristen prepared her usual kale smoothie in the kitchen. Victor sat silently at the island, reading something on his phone. I was on the back porch with a shawl over my shoulders, the same pale blue one I had taken back from the donation pile. I had just finished updating my notebook. But something shifted when I came inside. I heard voices from the study. Kristen was speaking quickly, her tone bright, like a real estate agent giving a pitch. Then I caught the sound of another voicemail, unfamiliar with a clipped professional cadence. I stopped just outside the door and listened. They were discussing the house, transfer titles, ownership percentages. Kristen mentioned Victor's name. Her own name, then paused before saying mine. Not with regard, just as a footnote. The man replied that the paperwork could be finalized before the end of the week if all signatures were in place. I felt something in me lock into place. When Kristen stepped out and noticed me standing there, she smiled and gestured toward the hallway like it was just a casual meeting. She said they were exploring options, planning ahead. I nodded slowly and went to the living room. I sat down on the couch, the same one where Joseph used to read the paper every Sunday. My hands rested in my lap, and for the first time in weeks, they didn't tremble. When Victor walked in, minutes later, holding a folder, he avoided my gaze. He said the notary had just arrived to go over some routine updates. I asked what kind of updates. His voice faltered. Kristen answered for him, placing a stack of documents on the coffee table. She said it was just formalizing things, that it made sense for the home to be in the names of those actively maintaining it. I asked her if that meant me being removed. She didn't reply. She just tapped a pen against the signature line. That was when I stood up. Not in a dramatic rush, just slow and sure. I told them this house no longer felt like mine. That was something I had quietly known for months. But now I said it aloud. I said it while looking them both in the eyes. Kristen looked annoyed. Victor looked ashamed. I picked up one of the documents and scanned it. I recognized the phrasing. Joseph had taught me enough about contracts to know when one had been rewritten to absorb an asset without consent. This wasn't a formality. This was a transfer. I looked at Victor again and told him this was the moment his silence became complicity. Then I turned to Kristen and said something I hadn't planned. I said the memories in this house were once sacred, that each corner held something Joseph and I had built together. The bookshelves, the porch swing, even the stain on the floorboard by the kitchen island where he once dropped a bottle of Merlot and laughed so hard he cried. I said the house might not be mine anymore, but the truth of what happened inside it was, and that was something no signature could erase. Kristen crossed her arms and told me the past couldn't be the foundation for every decision. I nodded. Then I walked upstairs. I didn't take the papers with me. I didn't rip them up. I just left them sitting there untouched, as if they had never mattered. That evening, I opened the drawer where I kept the flash drive Gary had given me. It contained every financial document Joseph had ever sent him. The investments, the property deeds, the full outline of the foundation we had been preparing. Everything. I updated my personal notes. Date, March 29th. Attempted legal erasure through asset reassignment. Witnessed, recorded, emotional manipulation present, consent not given. Then I wrote one sentence in all caps. I am still here. The next morning I packed a small bag and asked Victor to drive me to the lawyer's office. He didn't ask why. He just nodded, grabbed his keys, and followed me out the door. Kristen didn't come with us. In the car, we barely spoke. But right before we pulled into the parking lot, I looked at him and said thank you. Not for his help, but for finally showing me how much he had changed, and how much I hadn't. Inside Gary's office, I handed him the notebook, the flash drive, and the audio files I had compiled. He opened his legal pad and began to work. I wasn't erasing anyone. I was just choosing to remember what mattered, and defending it in the only way I knew how, with clarity, and no more permission. I had never known a silence more focused than the one in my bedroom that evening. It wasn't the quiet of being ignored. It wasn't the chill of being forgotten. It was the kind of silence that came after clarity. Not peace, but purpose. I sat on the edge of the bed, notebook open in front of me, flash drive tucked neatly in the side pocket. Everything was ready. Everything was labeled, organized, numbered. That's what decades of bookkeeping had taught me. Numbers never lied, and they remembered even when people chose not to. The light from the hallway cast a long shadow across the floor. I could hear Kristen's voice floating up the stairs. She was pacing while on a call again. I didn't care to listen. Not yet. Instead, I reached into my nightstand and pulled out the old recorder Gary had given me. It was small, matte, black, reliable. I clicked it on and let the red light blink for a few seconds before hitting record. My voice sounded dry at first. I cleared my throat once and started with the date. April 2nd, recording number 36, subject full observation and audio of private conversation regarding medical authority and financial transfer intent. I kept the recorder running as I moved to the hallway. Kristen's voice got clearer. She was speaking into her Bluetooth headset, her words sharp and clipped. She was explaining to someone that the medical documents would be easier to handle once my name was removed, that the insurance provider needed a clean file. Then she mentioned the house again. She said something about consolidating ownership to qualify for a specific tax deferment. She was saying it too fast, too smoothly, like she had rehearsed it all in her head a dozen times. I stood still at the top of the stairs and listened without moving. Then she paused. She asked the person on the other end of the call if a full revocation of next of kin rights could be pushed through under cognitive grounds. She even used the word frailty. I repeated that word quietly to myself as I clicked off the recorder. That night I listened back to the audio. Every word was crisp, documented, framed in her own tone of control. And instead of shaking or crying, I smiled, not out of satisfaction, but because there was nothing left to wonder about. No shadows, no questions. The whole thing was finally in full light. I added the audio file to the flash drive, then opened the foundation documents Gary had sent me. The Joseph M. Ellsworth Foundation. Every part of it was legal. Every cent transferred under the guidelines Joseph and I had established. I typed up a letter to Gary, confirming the schedule for finalizing the transition. I read through the clause about non-beneficiary status. Kristen's name wasn't anywhere in the documents, neither was Victor's. The foundation would exist entirely separate from them. It would carry Joseph's name. It would fund scholarships for older women returning to school for those starting over. For women like me. I thought of the first time I had ever touched a ledger. I was 16. The church needed someone to keep track of bake sale funds. I fell in love with the order of it, the way numbers lined up, the way each column told a truth you couldn't talk your way around. That memory steadied me. The next morning I came down early. Kristen had a yoga mat laid out in the living room. She didn't look up. Victor was in the kitchen making coffee. He gave me a stiff nod. I poured a glass of water and walked past them both. I didn't need to explain any more. I mailed the documents at the post office near the old grocery store. The clerk smiled when she saw the thick envelope and joked that it looked like I was sending off a novel. I just smiled back and said it was a kind of story, yes, one that needed to be told the right way. When I got home, no one asked where I had been. Later that afternoon, I took a slow walk through the backyard. The grass was thick with spring, and the first tulips had started to push through the earth by the fence. I knelt down and touched one of them. Yellow, the same shade Joseph once painted the garden bench with. That evening, I made one more recording. April 3rd, recording 37. Subject final thoughts before legal execution of transfer documents. I spoke clearly. I said I had not been erased. I had been removed, yes. Dismissed, silenced. But I had not disappeared. Because memory is not a room, and family is not a signature. I ended the recording and placed the device inside the safe beside the bed. Then I sat in the armchair near the window and watched the sun slide across the neighbor's roof. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clean. This was not revenge. It was preservation. And I had never been more certain. It rained lightly that morning. Not enough to soak the ground, just enough to blur the edges of things. I wore Joseph's old wool coat and walked down the church steps, slowly careful on the slick concrete. Gary stood by the curb, holding a thick folder under his arm. He gave me a single nod. We didn't speak. There was no need. Inside the fellowship hall, 3 folding chairs were placed side by side. Across from them, a simple table with a white runner. On it lay the signed declaration from the foundation, a framed photograph of Joseph in his grey cardigan and a vase of fresh marigolds. Kristen arrived last, walking in briskly in her heeled boots, shoulders stiff. Victor trailed behind her, eyes on the floor. He looked smaller than I remembered. Neither of them spoke to me. They sat without a word. Gary stepped to the table, opened the folder, and began reading. His voice was steady, factual. He spoke of the Joseph M. Ellsworth Foundation, its mission, its legal structure, and the full and irrevocable transfer of all assets formerly under my name into its custody. He read out the list of witnesses present. Then the statement that no family member residing in the Ellsworth household was listed as a beneficiary or entitled to draw from or manage the foundation's funds. The air in the room shifted. Kristen crossed her arms but said nothing. Victor leaned back, eyes closing for a moment, as if exhaling something he had held in too long. Gary then read the final line, that the property on Maple Hill Lane would be vacated within 30 days, and that no portion of it would pass to any current resident. It would serve as the administrative site for the foundation's operations. I remained seated, still, quiet. At that moment, 3 women entered from the back of the hall, Cheryl, May, and Doreen. Each carried something small. Cheryl had the first grant letter for a woman named Bonnie in Wisconsin. May held the non-profit registration certificate. Doreen placed a candle beside Joseph's picture. I watched Kristen's expression shift. She blinked quickly, her hands still in her lap. She wasn't used to being unseen in a room. Not like this. Not when something important was being decided. Victor turned toward me. I could tell he wanted to say something, but he didn't. Gary signed the final page and handed me the pen. I added my name with care. Each stroke steady. I didn't tremble. I didn't hesitate. When I finished, I closed the folder, stood up, and turned to the women beside me. "Thank you," I said. That was all. We didn't linger. We didn't celebrate. The candles stayed lit for the rest of the afternoon. I didn't glance back when I left the room. I didn't need to. The silence I had carried for months had finally been given shape. Not through anger, not through noise, but through the unmistakable clarity of something real being named, claimed, and set down in plain sight. And in that stillness, I had spoken louder than I ever had. The sky above Maple Hill Lane was pale and still. I stood at the end of the driveway, suitcase by my side, Joseph's coat folded neatly over my arm. The house looked quieter now, empty, even with people still living inside. A wind moved through the trees, lifting the edges of the few fallen leaves. I took one last look at the windows upstairs, the ones that used to let in soft morning light when I read beside him with coffee. The blinds were down now. I didn't feel sadness. Not anymore. What I felt was closer to release. Something unfastening inside me that had been held tight for far too long. In my coat pocket was the letter Joseph wrote on my 65th birthday. I hadn't looked at it in years. But that morning I unfolded it with care. The paper had softened with age, but the words still held their shape. His handwriting so deliberate. He wrote about the time we built that small bookshelf together, about how I always double-checked every bank statement even when he said I didn't have to. He said I gave shape to things. I held memory when others forgot. His last line stayed with me. Do not let them define the love you lived. I pressed the page against my chest for a moment, then tucked it back safely. That house was no longer my home. But the life I had built inside it would never belong to anyone else. I walked down the sidewalk slowly, my steps sure and even. At the corner, Doreen waited with her car. She waved gently from the driver's seat, no words needed. As we pulled away, I looked once over my shoulder, not to say goodbye, but to acknowledge what was left behind. Not bitterness, not loss, just a chapter closed. One I had finished writing in my own hand. Somewhere ahead, a new place was waiting. It wouldn't have my name on a deed or photos on the wall yet, but it would have something far more important. Space, air, light, and silence that I would choose, not the kind I had to survive. And in that silence, I would begin again. If you've ever felt invisible inside the home you helped build or silenced in the spaces you once filled with love, know this: your story matters. Your memory has weight, and like Marjorie, you have the power to reclaim it. If this story reminded you of someone you love or something you've lived through, you're not alone. Feel free to share your thoughts below. Sometimes the quietest voices carry the deepest truths.